At 16 minutes past 8 in the morning on the 6th of August, 1945, a city stopped answering. Not slowly. Not in stages. In a single instant, every wire that connected Hiroshima to the rest of Japan went quiet and stayed quiet and would go on staying quiet for the rest of that long, hot, incomprehensible day. 400 miles to the northeast, in Tokyo, nobody noticed. That is the strange truth at the center of this story. The most consequential morning of the 20th century did not announce itself with a scream. It announced itself with an absence. A dial tone that never connected, a telegraph key that clicked into nothing, a radio frequency that carried no voice. The men who governed the Japanese Empire, men who commanded 2 million soldiers, who had planned invasions across a third of the earth, who had spent 4 years learning to read the exact shape of American bombing, would spend 2 days trying to understand a silence, and 8 more arguing about what it meant. And by the time they understood it, a second city would already be gone. This is the story of those 3 days. Not from the cockpit, not from the ground beneath the cloud. From the rooms in Tokyo where the news arrived late, arrived wrong, arrived in fragments, and had to be assembled by exhausted men into a picture they did not want to see. Because when the Japanese High Command finally realized what had happened to Hiroshima, what they said was not one dramatic line. It was an argument. It lasted 10 days. It ended with a suicide, an attempted coup, and a voice on the radio that 99% of Japan had never heard before. But it began here, with a phone that didn't ring. And before we go into that room, understand what was riding on it. That same August, the United States was assembling the invasion of Japan. Operation Olympic, 14 divisions were to land on the beaches of southern Kyushu on the 1st of November. American planners, working out what that would cost, ordered roughly 500,000 Purple Heart medals struck in advance. They were never needed. The military was still issuing decorations from that stockpile more than 70 years later. Whether the men on those transports ever went ashore was decided by an argument in a basement in Tokyo. They were never told it was happening. This is that argument. Let us start with the room and the men inside it. The nerve center of the Imperial Japanese Army sat on a hill in the Ichigaya district of Tokyo, in a complex of buildings that had survived the firebombings largely by accident. By August of 1945, much of the work had moved underground into tunnels and concrete chambers where the air was stale and the lights buzzed and the maps on the walls showed an empire that was mostly imaginary. The vice chief of the Army General Staff was a lieutenant general named Kawabe Torishiro, 55 years old. A career staff officer, precise, self-contained, the kind of man who kept a diary in small, careful handwriting and wrote in it every night regardless of how the day had gone. We know a great deal about what happened in Tokyo during these days. For one simple reason, Kawabe Torishiro wrote it down. Above, the chief of the Army General Staff, Umezu Yoshijiro, 63. A hard man, unsentimental, with a reputation for saying very little and meaning all of it. Umezu had spent years in Manchuria. He believed, in August of 1945, that the Japanese army had not yet been defeated because it had not yet been beaten in the field on Japanese soil. And above them both, in the political order, if not the military one, the Minister of War, General Anami Korichika. 58 years old, remember that name. Everything in this story eventually collides with it. Anami was not the caricature of the fanatical Japanese general. He was a calligrapher. He'd practiced kendo. He was known for treating junior officers with a warmth that senior commanders rarely bothered with. He had served as a military aide in the imperial household and had a personal relationship with the emperor that few soldiers could claim. He was also, in August 1945, the single most dangerous man in Japan because the Japanese constitution gave the army the power to collapse any cabinet simply by withdrawing its minister, and Anami Korichika was that minister. If Anami resigned, the government fell. If the government fell, no surrender could be negotiated. One man, one decision, and the war continued. Across the table from him, in the strange power-sharing arrangement that governed Japan's final months, sat the men who wanted it to end. Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro, 77 years old. A retired admiral, hard of hearing, given to long silences and answers so vague that even his own cabinet could not always tell what he had decided. There was a reason for the vagueness. In February of 1936, during a failed coup by young officers, Suzuki had been shot 4 times in his home. He survived because his wife physically placed herself between him and the officer who came to deliver the killing shot. Suzuki Kantaro knew exactly what happened in Japan to men who moved too openly toward peace. He had the scars. Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori, 62. Career diplomat. Descended from Korean potters brought to Japan centuries earlier, which in the rigid society of Imperial Japan meant he had always been slightly outside the circle. He had been foreign minister at the beginning of the war in December 1941, and now he was foreign minister at the end of it. Togo had spent the summer of 1945 pursuing one desperate idea, that the Soviet Union, still technically neutral, might be persuaded to mediate a peace with the United States on terms Japan could survive. Navy Minister Yonai Mitsumasa, 65. A former prime minister himself, cool and unreadable, privately convinced the war had been lost for at least a year and publicly careful never to say so in a way that could be quoted. Together with Umezu and Admiral Toyota Soamu, 60, the chief of the Navy General Staff, these 6 men formed the Supreme Council for the direction of the war. In English, it is usually called the Big Six. 3 of them wanted to end the war. 3 of them did not. 3 against 3. It had been 3 against 3 for weeks. Nothing in the Japanese system could break a tie like that, not the prime minister, not the cabinet, not the constitution. The council operated by consensus, and consensus did not exist. There was one more man, and he sat outside the council entirely. Marquis Kido Koichi, 56. He held no military rank and commanded no troops. What he held was access. Kido saw the emperor almost daily. He was the channel through which the political world reached the throne, and the throne reached back. Every important thing that happens in the next 9 days passes at some point through Kido Koichi, and at the top of it all, in the imperial palace in the center of Tokyo, a 44-year-old man who by centuries of tradition was not supposed to make decisions at all. Hirohito Showa, a trained marine biologist, slight, soft-spoken, nearsighted. In the Japanese constitutional order he reigned, he did not rule. His ministers debated, reached consensus, and presented him with a conclusion. He approved it. That was the arrangement. That was how it had worked for the entire modern history of the country. It was about to stop working. Now, the shape of Japan in the summer of 1945. By August, the American strategic bombing campaign had burned out 66 Japanese cities. Not damaged. The B-29 raids had shifted from high-altitude precision attacks, which had never worked well over Japan, because of a jet stream. Nobody had planned for it, low-altitude night attacks with incendiaries against cities built largely of wood and paper. On the night of the 9th of March, 1945, more than 300 B-29s had struck Tokyo with napalm-filled cluster bombs. The fires merged into a single conflagration. The heat generated its own wind, canals boiled. Somewhere around 100,000 people died in a single night, more than would die in the initial blast at Hiroshima. Roughly 16 square miles of the capital simply ceased to exist. By August, this was routine. It had happened to Osaka, to Nakobe, to Yokohama, to city after city down the list. Japanese air defense was at this point essentially theoretical. There was almost no aviation fuel. The trained pilots were dead. The interceptors that remained were being hoarded for the invasion everyone knew was coming, and there was no food. The rice ration had fallen below subsistence. Rail transport was collapsing. The merchant fleet, which had once carried oil and rubber and rice from an empire stretching to Burma, had been sunk almost entirely by American submarines. Japan was a nation of 70 million people on 4 islands with no fuel, no shipping, and no harvest. The Big Six knew all of this. Every one of them. That is the thing to hold on to. The argument in Tokyo in August 1945 was not between men who thought Japan could win and men who thought Japan had lost. All 6 knew Japan had lost. The argument was about something else, and we will get to it. On the 26th of July from Potsdam, the Allies had issued a declaration. It called for the unconditional surrender of the Japanese armed forces and warned of prompt and utter destruction otherwise. It said nothing explicit about the fate of the emperor. That silence was the whole problem. On the 28th of July, Prime Minister Suzuki, under pressure from the army to say something dismissive, told reporters that the government would give the declaration the treatment of mokusatsu. It is a difficult word. Literally, to kill with silence. It can mean to withhold comment. It can mean to treat with contempt. The Allied press translated it as rejection. 9 days later, a single B-29 flew toward a city that, until that morning, had been notable for one thing: nothing had happened to it. Hiroshima sat on a delta at the mouth of the Oda River, laced with 7 channels and crossed by dozens of bridges. It was not a spared city by accident of geography. It was a military city and had been for 70 years. The Second General Army had its headquarters there. This was one of two commands created in April 1945 to defend the home islands against invasion. The Second General Army would be responsible for the defense of Western Japan, including Kyushu, where the Americans were expected to land. Its commander was Field Marshal Hata Shunroku, 66 years old, one of the most senior officers in the entire Japanese army. The Chugoku Regional Army was headquartered there too, in the grounds of Hiroshima Castle, with a reinforced communications bunker dug beneath it. The Army Marine Headquarters sat at the port of Ujina, running the vast fleet of small transports that had moved Japanese soldiers across Asia for a decade. There were barracks, depots, factories, a garrison of roughly 40,000 troops. And there were people. Something in the range of 340 to 350,000 of them were present in the city that morning, counting soldiers and the school children who had been mobilized to tear down houses to create fire breaks. They had a theory about why they had been spared, several theories actually, and they contradicted each other, and everybody believed them anyway. That an American general's mother lived nearby, that the Americans intended to make Hiroshima their occupation headquarters and wanted it intact, that the city was simply too unimportant to bother with. The real reason was colder. Hiroshima had been placed on a reserve list in the spring, protected from conventional attack, so that the effects of a specific weapon could be measured against an undamaged city. At 7 that morning, the air raid sirens sounded. A single American aircraft had been detected. This was normal. Single reconnaissance aircraft came over constantly. This one was called Straight Flush, and it was checking the weather over the target. At 7, the all clear sounded. That is the detail that matters most. When the Enola Gay arrived at 31,000 feet less than an hour later, the alert had been lifted. People were on the streets. Children were in the firebreak clearing crews. Workers were arriving at their factories. Almost nobody took cover, because there was no warning to take cover from. The bomb was called Little Boy. 10 feet long, roughly 9,700 pounds, a gun-type uranium device that worked by firing one mass of uranium-235 into another. It fell for 43 seconds. It detonated at approximately 1,900 feet above the Shima Surgical Clinic, a few hundred yards from the aiming point at the Ioi Bridge. The yield was around 15 kilotons. We are not going to linger on the ground here. That comes later in this story, and it deserves its own time, told properly. For now, hold only the facts that matter to Tokyo. Somewhere between 70 and 80,000 people died in that instant or within hours. Roughly 2/3 of the city's buildings were destroyed. The fires that followed burned through the afternoon. And the entire communications infrastructure of a major regional military headquarters, every telephone exchange, every telegraph line, every radio transmitter was destroyed simultaneously. That is why Tokyo heard nothing. Not because Hiroshima had vanished, but because Hiroshima had been struck deaf and mute in the same second. The first person in Japan to notice was almost certainly a control room operator at the Japan Broadcasting Corporation in Tokyo. The Hiroshima station had gone off the air. He tried to raise it on the studio-to-studio line. The line was dead. He tried the alternate route, also dead. He reported it upward, as he was required to do, and somewhere in the building a note was made about a technical fault in the Chugoku region. Around the same time, at the Central Telegraph Office of the Japanese Railways, an operator working the main line noticed that the trunk telegraph had stopped functioning just short of Hiroshima. Trains west of that point were unreachable. This too was reported, and this too was filed as a technical fault because in a country where 66 cities had been burned, technical faults were the most ordinary thing in the world. Here is what did not happen. There was no alarm, no general alert, no emergency conference, because the reports contained nothing alarming. A radio station off the air is a broken transmitter. A telegraph line down is a cut cable. Neither of those things describes a catastrophe. They describe a Tuesday. The information that something had actually happened came from somewhere else entirely. And this is the first genuine shock of this story. It did not come from Field Marshal Hata's staff. It did not come from the Chugoku Regional Army's duty officers. It did not come from any general, or any colonel, or any communications specialist in the Imperial Japanese Army. It came from a 14-year-old girl. Her name was Okayoshi. She was a student at Hijiyama Girls' High School, and like tens of thousands of Japanese schoolchildren in 945, her education had effectively ended and been replaced by war work. She had been assigned to the communications section of the Chugoku Regional Army Headquarters, in the underground bunker beneath Hiroshima Castle, operating a switchboard. She was underground when the bomb detonated. That is the only reason she lived. When she came back to herself, the bunker was full of dust and the lights had failed and the girls around her were screaming. The concrete had held. Above them, the castle, a 5-story wooden keep that had stood since the 16th century, was gone, collapsed into its own foundations. Most of the phone lines were dead, most but not all. There was a direct military line that ran east toward Fukuyama and it still worked. An officer told her to send a message, and Oka Yoshi, 14 years old, sitting in the dark in a bunker under a destroyed castle, transmitted the first report of the atomic bombing of a city in human history. She said that Hiroshima had been attacked by a new type of bomb and that the city was in a state of near total destruction. That was it. 2 facts. A new type of bomb. The city is destroyed, and among the people in Hiroshima that morning, not all of them were Japanese. Something in the order of 20,000 were Koreans, most of them brought to Japan as forced labor. And in a holding cell near the center of the city, there were American prisoners of war airmen shot down over Japan in the preceding weeks. Most of them died in the blast or shortly after it. The first Americans killed by an American atomic bomb died in Hiroshima on the 6th of August, and their families were not told for years. Think about what that message had to survive to reach Tokyo. It went from a child in a bunker to a relay station in Fukuyama, into the military communications network, upward through a chain of officers who each had to decide whether to believe it and pass it on. Every one of those men had spent 4 years receiving panicked, exaggerated, wrong reports from cities under attack. By the time it reached Ichigaya, it was 1 line in a stack of paper. Around the same time, other fragments began arriving. The naval base at Kure, 12 miles to the southeast, reported an enormous cloud over Hiroshima. Small stations on the rail lines ringing the city reported an explosion of extraordinary force. Reports came in of a flash visible from great distances, and of a shock that broke windows and knocked people off their feet miles from the city. And the fragments did not fit together. Some described total destruction, some described a large fire, some described only a light and a bang. The reports that came from closest to the center were the least coherent, because the people closest to the center were in shock, or blind, or dying. The reports that came from far away were calmer and therefore less alarming. The Imperial General Headquarters had one further piece of information, and it was the piece that made everything harder. The radar and observer network had tracked the aircraft, not a formation, not 200 B-29s in a bomber stream the way they had come to Tokyo in March. A very small number of aircraft flying high which had been assessed as reconnaissance and not engaged, so the staff officers at Ichigaya were now holding 2 propositions that could not both be true. First, Hiroshima had been effectively destroyed. Second, almost no aircraft had been over Hiroshima. Pick one. Because in August of 1945, based on every single thing the Japanese army had learned in 4 years of being bombed, they could not both be correct. Destroying a city took 300 aircraft and thousands of tons of incendiaries in an entire night. That was not an opinion. That was measured, documented, bitterly learned fact. An intelligence officer in that building looked at those 2 reports and did the only rational thing a professional could do. He concluded that one of them was wrong. And now we arrive at the second great irony of this story, and it is a genuinely strange one. The reason the Japanese army rejected the atomic explanation was not ignorance. It was expertise. Japan had an atomic bomb program. 2 of them, in fact, competing rather than cooperating, which tells you a great deal about the relationship between the Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy. The Army's program was called NIGO. It was run out of the Institute of Physical and Chemical Research in Tokyo, known as RIKEN, and it was directed by a man named Nishina Yoshio. Nishina was 54 years old in August 1945, and he was the most distinguished physicist in Japan. He had spent 6 years in Europe in the 1920s, most of it in Copenhagen, working in the Institute of Niels Bohr. He and Bohr had become close. Nishina had co-authored a formula on the scattering of photons that still bears his name. He had brought quantum mechanics to Japan more or less personally. He had built the country's cyclotrons. If anyone in the Japanese Empire could recognize an atomic bomb, it was Nishina Yoshio, which is exactly why he did not believe there was one. Nishina's team had been working on uranium since 1941. They understood the physics perfectly well. The physics was published, it was international, it had been in the journals since 1939. What they did not have was any way to do it. To build a uranium bomb, you have to separate uranium-235 from uranium-238. The two isotopes are chemically identical. They differ only in mass, by about 1%. Separating them requires enormous purpose-built industrial plants consuming staggering amounts of electricity. The NIGO team had attempted thermal diffusion. Their apparatus was small, experimental, and barely functional. They had struggled to obtain uranium ore at all, scraping for supplies from Korea and Burma, and asking Germany for a shipment that never arrived. Their electrical supply was rationed. Their best young researchers had been conscripted. And on the 13th of April, 1945, in an American incendiary raid on Tokyo, the Riken building housing the thermal diffusion separator burned down. The Navy's program EFSAKU at Kyoto Imperial University was even further from a weapon. Arakatsu was working on ultracentrifuge separation. He had a design, he did not have a machine. Earlier in the war, Japanese scientists had been asked to assess whether the United States could build such a weapon in time to affect the outcome. Their conclusion was reasonable, defensible, and completely wrong, that no nation, not even America, could divert the industrial capacity required while simultaneously fighting a global war. So when the reports came in from Hiroshima on the 6th of August, and someone in the room raised the possibility of an atomic weapon, the counter-argument was not superstition or denial. It was Japan's own scientific experience, stated by the people who had lived it. We tried. We have first-class physicists. We could not separate enough uranium to fill a thimble. The Americans had been fighting a war on two oceans. They cannot have built two entire industries we could not build one of. The most expert men in the country had the strongest possible reason to disbelieve the truth. This is not a Japanese failing. It is a human one. Expertise tells you what is possible. And when something impossible happens, the experts are the last to accept it, because they are the ones who know precisely how impossible it was. And somewhere in the ruins that afternoon, a 66-year-old field marshal was getting to his feet. Tokyo would not learn that for another full day. When they did, it would change the argument completely and not in the direction you would expect. Late in the afternoon of the 6th, the Army General Staff made the only decision available to it. Go and look. Lieutenant General Arisueso, 50 years old, was the chief of the 2nd Bureau of the Army General Staff Military Intelligence. He was ordered to assemble an investigation party and proceed to Hiroshima immediately. Nishina Yoshio was to be included, along with medical officers and engineers. An aircraft was arranged. It would leave the following morning. That gap, the hours between the order and the departure, tells you everything about the state of Japan in August 1945. The empire that had once struck Pearl Harbor from 6 aircraft carriers now needed most of a day to put one transport plane in the air. And so the 6th of August ended in Tokyo the way it had begun, with a stack of contradictory paper, an argument that had not resolved, and a silence to the West that nobody could explain. The Big Six did not meet that day. Read that again, because it is one of the most surprising facts in this entire story. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, the 6 men who controlled the Japanese Empire, did not convene on the 6th of August, 1945. Not out of indifference, out of process. There was no confirmed report yet. There was nothing to convene about. You do not summon the Supreme Council to discuss a rumor from a 14-year-old on a switchboard and a naval station's description of a large cloud. The machinery required certainty before it would turn, and certainty was still hours away. Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori went home that evening with fragments. Marquis Kido Koichi went to his rooms in the palace grounds with fragments. General Anami Korechika read what there was and went to bed. Lieutenant General Kawabe Torishiro sat down that night and wrote in his diary that a report had come in about Hiroshima. Recorded it carefully, as he recorded everything. There is no thunder in the entry. It is the note of a professional logging an incident that has not yet been explained. Somewhere over the Pacific, the Enola Gay had already landed on Tinian. Colonel Paul Tibbets had already been decorated on the runway. And a statement drafted weeks earlier in Washington was waiting for release. The truth about Hiroshima did not reach the Japanese government through Japanese channels. By radio, from the enemy, in English, in the middle of the night. At approximately 11 o'clock in the morning Washington time on the 6th of August, the White House released a statement from President Harry S. Truman, who was at that moment aboard the cruiser Augusta returning from Potsdam. Washington was 13 hours behind Tokyo. 11 in the morning in Washington on the 6th was midnight in Tokyo at the beginning of the 7th. The statement said that 16 hours earlier an American aircraft had dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. It said the bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It said it was an atomic bomb that had harnessed the basic power of the universe, that the force from which the sun draws its power had been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. And then it said the part that turned a weapon into a strategy. It warned that if Japan did not accept the Allied terms, it could expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which had never been seen on this earth. The statement went out to the world. It went out on shortwave. And in Japan, there was a small unit whose entire job was to listen to exactly that kind of broadcast. Domei, the state news agency, operated a monitoring service that intercepted foreign radio transmissions. In the small hours of the 7th of August, a monitor on shift picked up the American broadcast and began transcribing. He was writing down the word atomic. What happened next was not dramatic in the way films are dramatic. It was a series of telephone calls, made in the dark, by frightened middle-ranking men waking up their superiors. The word reached Domei's senior editors. From Domei, it went to the Cabinet Information Bureau. It went to the Foreign Ministry. It went to the Army General Staff. By the early morning of the 7th of August, the leadership of Japan knew what had been dropped on Hiroshima, and they knew because Harry Truman had told them. Sit with that for a moment. The Imperial Japanese Army had a field marshal on the scene. It had a regional army headquarters, a marine headquarters, 40,000 troops, an intelligence bureau, and a nationwide communications network. And the government of Japan learned what had happened to its own city from an enemy press release, transmitted from 8,000 miles away, in a foreign language, at midnight. That is what total defeat actually looks like. Not a flag lowered, not a surrender ceremony, a government that has to tune in to find out what happened inside its own borders. The reaction inside the Japanese leadership in those first hours divided almost immediately, and the division was not really about physics. Togo Shigenori read the intercept and understood at once that this was the argument he had been waiting for. For months he had been unable to move the council. He had needed something so large that the war faction could not simply absorb it into the endless ledger of Japanese suffering. This, he believed, was it. The Army General Staff read the same intercept and reached for a different tool. Truman's statement, they observed, was propaganda. Of course, the Americans would claim a revolutionary weapon. That was the entire purpose of releasing such a statement. Claiming a bomb that ends cities is precisely what you do when you want a war to end without an invasion. Until Japanese scientists stood on Japanese ground and examined the evidence, this was an enemy assertion, nothing more. And here the Army made a decision that would shape the following week, a decision about language. Japanese media and official communications would not use the word atomic. The Hiroshima attack would be described using a phrase that meant roughly a new type bomb. Shingata Bakudan. It was censorship, and it was also something more calculated than that. The Army understood that the word atomic carried an implication. The phrase new type bomb did not, that there could be more, that Japan had no defense, that continued resistance was not courage but arithmetic. So the word was kept out of the newspapers. The Japanese public was told that a small number of enemy aircraft had attacked Hiroshima with a new type of bomb and that considerable damage had resulted. Details were being investigated. Citizens were reminded not to be misled by enemy propaganda. In the city of Hiroshima itself, survivors were walking through ash looking for their families, and the government of their country was carefully not naming what had killed them. On the morning of the 7th of August in Tokyo, three things were true simultaneously. The government now knew from the American statement that the weapon was atomic. The Army officially did not accept this, pending investigation. And the investigation team had not yet left the ground. Lieutenant General Arisu Seizo's aircraft departed Tokyo that morning and came down at Hiroshima in the afternoon of the 7th, with intelligence officers, engineers, and medical staff aboard. Nishina Yoshio, the physicist who did not believe it was possible, was delayed. He would not reach the city until the 8th. They flew west across a country that had been burned in patches, over cities that were grids of ash with the street plans still visible in the rubble. They had all seen bombed cities before, every one of them. As they came in toward Hiroshima, the men aboard that aircraft looked down and saw something none of them had a category for. Not a burned district inside a living city, not a scattering of craters, a circle, a near-perfect circle of flattening, with the rivers and the bridges of the delta still drawn across it like lines on a map from which everything else had been rubbed away. Arisu Seizo was an intelligence officer. His entire professional life had been the assessment of evidence, and what he saw from that window began immediately the process by which the Japanese army would be forced to accept what it had spent a day and a night refusing. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Markikito Koichi sought an audience with the emperor. And in Moscow, 6,000 miles away, Japan's ambassador, Sato Naotake, 63 years old, was requesting a meeting with the Soviet foreign minister, a meeting he had been requesting in one form or another for weeks. He had been telling Tokyo for months that their entire diplomatic strategy was built on a fantasy. Nobody in Tokyo had wanted to hear it. They were about to find out how right he had been. The cabinet met on the morning of the 7th of August. Not the Supreme Council. The full cabinet, 15 ministers, around a table in a building that had survived the firebombings because there was not much left in that district worth burning twice. Coal minister, agriculture minister, transport minister. Men who spent their days managing a country that had run out of everything. Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori came into that room holding the intercept of Truman's statement. He had waited months for a lever this size. He put the argument plainly. The Americans had announced an atomic weapon. They had announced there would be more. Whatever the army wished to call it, the situation had changed in kind, not in degree, and Japan should move immediately to accept the Potsdam Declaration. Across the table, General Anami Korochika did not shout. That detail matters, and it is one of the most misunderstood things about these 9 days. The image of the Japanese war minister as a screaming fanatic is a cartoon. Anami was 58, a calligrapher, a kendo practitioner, a man who had served as an aide in the imperial household and who wept easily in private. He argued the way a careful man argues. He said the investigation was not complete. The army had a team on the ground as of that morning. Until Japanese scientists examined Japanese soil and reported to the Japanese government, everything they had was an enemy broadcast, and an enemy broadcast is a weapon, not a fact. He was not wrong about that. That is the uncomfortable part. Truman's statement was, among other things, precisely an instrument of psychological warfare. It was designed to end a war without an invasion. Anami was asking the question any professional would ask, is this true or is this what they want us to believe? The difference was that this time it was both. The cabinet reached no decision on surrender. It reached a decision about words. The Hiroshima attack would be described publicly as an attack by a new type of bomb. Not atomic. The Cabinet Information Bureau would issue guidance to newspapers and radio. Details were under investigation. The public would be reminded that the enemy was attempting to exploit the incident for propaganda purposes. And so, on the 7th of August, the government of Japan told its own people almost nothing about the thing that had happened to them. Understand what that censorship actually accomplished, because it was not simply cowardice. If the word atomic entered the Japanese press, 3 ideas entered with it. That the weapon could be repeated, that there was no defense, no shelter, no interceptor, no dispersal plan that meant anything. And that continued resistance was therefore not a question of spirit, but a question of subtraction. The army could not permit those 3 ideas into the public mind, because the entire strategy for the defense of the home islands depended on the belief that sacrifice could still purchase something. So the word was held back. And in Hiroshima, people who had been standing in the open at 16 minutes past 8 were dying of something nobody would name. Now we have to go to the ground. Not because this story needs horror. Because everything the men in Tokyo argued about for the next 8 days was made of what happened in that city. And if we skip it, the argument becomes weightless. 6 men in a room debating an abstraction. It was not an abstraction. At the moment of detonation, roughly 1,900 feet above the Shima Surgical Clinic, the temperature at the center of the fireball reached several million degrees. On the ground directly beneath, the surface temperature rose to somewhere in the range of 5,000 to 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. For an instant, the light was brighter than the sun. People a mile away described it not as a flash, but as a change in the nature of the world, as if everything had been photographed at once. A man on a bridge saw the shadows of the railings printed onto the roadway. On the stone steps of a bank building near the center, there remained a darker patch where a person had been sitting, waiting for the doors to open. The stone around them had been bleached by the light. They had not. That is what a shadow at Hiroshima actually is. It is not the person. It is the absence of the bleaching. It is the last place they interrupted the light. The blast wave followed. At the hypocenter, the pressure came down at more than 10 tons on every square yard, and behind it came a wind faster than any that has ever occurred in nature. Buildings within a mile were not blown over so much as pressed down. Roof tiles across the city center had their surfaces melted, glazed by the heat before the wind arrived to scatter them. Then the fires. Hiroshima was a city of wood. Charcoal braziers were lit in kitchens all across it because it was breakfast time on a Monday. The fires merged within 20 minutes into a firestorm that consumed roughly 4.5 square miles of an estimated 340 to 350,000 people in the city. Somewhere between 70 and 80,000 died that day. But the number that mattered to Tokyo, the number that would reach the Supreme Council over the following days, was not the number of the dead. It was the behavior of the living. Survivors walked. That is the detail that appears in report after report, from doctors and soldiers and relief workers who came in from the surrounding towns. People with no visible fatal injury walked out of the city, sat down, and over the following hours, days, and weeks began to fail. They vomited. Their hair came out in handfuls, painlessly, in clumps. Purple spots appeared beneath the skin. They bled from the gums, from the nose, from the intestines. Wounds that had been healing opened again and would not close. Their bodies had lost the ability to make blood and to fight infection. The doctors of Hiroshima, those who had survived, in a city where most of the hospitals were gone and most of the physicians were dead or injured, had no word for what they were seeing. They wrote of a strange sickness. They tried vitamin injections. They tried everything they knew. Nothing worked. Nothing could have. And then there were the people who came afterward. Relief workers, soldiers sent in to clear debris. Family members from surrounding villages who walked into Hiroshima on the 7th and the 8th and the 9th of August, looking for a daughter, a father, a son. Many of them had not been within 30 miles of the city when the bomb fell. Some of them sickened too. That was the fact that would land on the table in Tokyo and change the character of the entire argument. Not that a bomb had destroyed a city. Bombs destroyed cities. Tokyo had lost 100,000 people in a single night in March. This was different. The place itself had been made dangerous. The ground was hostile to the people who walked on it. And there was one more thing on the ground, and this is where the story turns back on itself in a way almost nobody expects. Field Marshal Hata Shunroku was alive, 66 years old, commander of the 2nd General Army, the man responsible for the defense of all of Western Japan against the coming invasion. He had been at his residence about 1.5 miles from the hypocenter. He was thrown down. He was cut by flying glass. That was all. By the afternoon of the 6th, he had gathered surviving officers. He established a command post outside the destroyed zone. He requested troops from neighboring prefectures for relief work. He began compiling a report for Tokyo. Hiroshima had not vanished. We say it vanished because that is what it felt like, and because that is what the first fragment suggested, and because it is the phrase that has survived in the language. But the arithmetic was otherwise. 2/3 of the buildings destroyed, 1/3 standing. 70 to 80,000 dead, around 270,000 alive. A field marshal functioning, a staff reconstituted within 12 hours. Trains reaching the outskirts within a day. To Togo Shigenori, those numbers meant, how many more of these can this country survive? To Anami Korichika, they meant something entirely different. They meant that the most powerful weapon in the history of the world had been used against a Japanese city, and it had not killed the commanding general, had not eliminated the headquarters, had not prevented the reconstitution of command by nightfall. Devastating, unprecedented, and in the cold vocabulary of a general staff, not decisive. Both men were looking at the same page. Neither was lying. They were asking different questions, and the answers pointed in opposite directions. On the morning of the 8th of August, Nishina Yoshio landed at Hiroshima. He was 54 years old. He had studied in Copenhagen under Niels Bohr for 6 years. He had brought quantum mechanics into Japan more or less on his own back. He had built the country's cyclotrons. He directed the NIGO project, Japan's attempt to build the same weapon, and he knew better than any living Japanese exactly how impossible it was. He had spent 2 days arguing that it could not be done. He had told colleagues that separating enough uranium-235 was beyond any nation's capacity in wartime. He had reason. His own separator had burned in an American raid in April, and it had never worked properly before that. He came down through the smoke, and he began to walk. Now think about what it means for a physicist to walk into that. He was not reading a report. He was checking his own equations against a landscape. He looked at the roof tiles. Their surfaces were blistered and glazed, which told him about radiant heat delivered in a fraction of a second rather than heat from a fire, because fire would have cracked them differently. He looked at the shadows on stone, sharp-edged, which told him the source had been effectively a point, high above, and had lasted an instant. He looked at the pattern of the destruction. Buildings near the center had been pressed straight down. Buildings further out had been pushed over, and the direction they fell all pointed back to the same spot in the sky. He could work backwards from that to the height of the burst. He looked at the survivors' burns, on one side of the body only, on the exposed skin only. In some cases, the pattern of a kimono printed into the flesh, dark fabric, absorbing heat and light fabric reflecting it. That is not fire. Fire wraps around a person. This had come from one direction, at the speed of light, and it had been over before anyone could turn. And then he measured the radius of total destruction, and he did the arithmetic that he had done 100 times on paper. Roughly a mile of near total flattening. Working from the blast physics, he arrived at an energy release equivalent to somewhere in the region of 10 to 20,000 tons of high explosive, delivered by a single device. There is no conventional explosive on Earth that does that. Nishina Yoshio, the man in Japan who had the strongest professional reason to say no, was the man who had to say yes. He reported to Lieutenant General Arasu Seizo that the weapon had been an atomic bomb. Here is why that moment carries the weight it does. If any second-rate scientist had said it, the Army General Staff would have dismissed it. If a politician had said it, they would have called it defeatism. If the Americans said it and they had it was propaganda. But Nishina had spent 4 years failing to build one. His verdict could not be waved away as panic or naivety or enemy influence because he was the last man in Japan who wanted it to be true. There was one more piece of evidence, and it was the one that mattered most for what came next. Nishina and the survey team could detect residual radioactivity in the ruins. What it meant for the people walking into the city afterward, nobody in August 1945 could say with confidence. It would take months of medical work to begin to understand it, and decades to measure it properly. But the survey team came out of Hiroshima knowing one thing they had not known going in. The ground itself was not finished with people yet. The team's findings went back to Tokyo. Now hold that, because while Nishina was walking through Hiroshima on the 8th of August, something else was happening 6,000 miles away, and it would matter more to the men in the Supreme Council than anything Nishina found. For 4 months, the entire diplomatic strategy of the Japanese Empire had rested on a single hope. The Soviet Union was not at war with Japan. The two countries had signed a neutrality pact in April 1941. In April 1945, Moscow had given notice that it would not renew the pact when it expired, but under its own terms. The pact remained in force for another year, until April 1946. Tokyo chose to read that as time. The plan, such as it was to ask Stalin to mediate, to use Moscow as a channel to Washington and London. To obtain, through Soviet good offices, terms better than unconditional surrender, above all, a guarantee for the position of the emperor. The man tasked with executing this plan was Japan's ambassador in Moscow, Sato Naotaki, 63 years old. A career diplomat, formerly foreign minister himself, and a man with an unusual and inconvenient quality for a subordinate in a collapsing empire. He told the truth in writing. Through June and July, Sato sent cable after cable back to Tokyo, and the substance of them was brutal. The Soviets had no interest in mediating. They would not lift a finger to help Japan obtain better terms. Japan had nothing to offer them that they could not simply take. And Japan was pursuing this fantasy while refusing to say concretely what terms it would accept, which made the whole exercise, in Sato's blunt assessment, meaningless. He went further than a diplomat is supposed to go. He told his own government that Japan's position was hopeless and that it should face reality. Tokyo did not act on it. Togo, who was himself a former ambassador to Moscow and who half agreed with Sato, was trapped. He could not tell Sato what terms Japan would accept because the Supreme Council could not agree on any. 3 against 3. So the instructions that went back to Moscow remained vague, and Sato kept requesting meetings and the Soviets kept stalling him. They were stalling him because Stalin had already made a commitment at Yalta in February to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of the German surrender. Germany surrendered on the 8th of May. 3 months later was the 8th of August. At around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Moscow time on the 8th of August, Sato Naotake finally got the meeting he had been requesting for weeks. He was received by Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister. He had gone in to ask one more time about mediation. Molotov did not let him begin. He read out a declaration. The Soviet Union considered itself at war with Japan from the 9th of August. Sato stood in that room and understood in a few seconds that 4 months of his government's diplomatic strategy had been not merely unsuccessful but delusional, and that he had said so, in writing, repeatedly, and had been ignored. He asked to send a cable to Tokyo. He was permitted to. The cable never got through. The Soviets had cut the line. Tokyo learned of the Soviet declaration of war the way it had learned about Hiroshima, from a radio broadcast. Soviet forces crossed the Manchurian frontier just after midnight on the 9th of August. Roughly 1.5 million men, in a coordinated offensive across a front of more than 2,700 miles, from Mongolia in the west to the Pacific coast in the east, with more than 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. The force facing them was the Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, the command that had effectively created the puppet state of Manchukuo and had operated for years as a law unto itself. By August 1945, it was a shell around 700,000 men on paper, and most of them were not soldiers in any sense the 1,941 Kwantung Army would have recognized. Its best divisions had been stripped away over 3 years and fed into the Pacific. What remained was largely made up of recent conscripts, reservists, and men who should have been too old. Its equipment was obsolete. Its fuel was gone. It came apart in days. Soviet armored columns crossed the greater Khingan Mountains terrain the Japanese had assessed as impassable to tanks and appeared behind the defensive line. Positions were bypassed and encircled. Communications collapsed within 48 hours. Entire formations lost contact with headquarters and never regained it. And in Manchuria, there were Japanese civilians. Hundreds of thousands of settlers, farming families who had been sent there under state colonization programs through the 1930s. Their men had been conscripted. What was left were women, children, and the elderly in the path of an offensive. What happened to them over the following weeks was among the worst civilian catastrophes of the entire war for Japan. Now put the two things together, the way the Supreme Council had to on the morning of the 9th of August. The atomic bomb destroyed a city. Terrible. But the army had an answer to it, or believed it did disperse the factories, dig deeper, accept the losses, and note that a bomb does not occupy ground. A bomb cannot take an island. Only soldiers take islands, and when the Americans landed, the Japanese army intended to make the price unbearable. That was the plan. The decisive operation. Its logic was not fantasy. Japanese intelligence had correctly deduced where the land southern Kyushu and had reinforced it heavily. American planners estimated the defenders at around 300,000. The actual figure was closer to 900,000. And by late July, American codebreakers had begun to realize it. The men who would have gone ashore on the 1st of November were going to walk into 3 times the enemy they had been told to expect. Thousands of aircraft had been hidden and preserved for suicide attack, along with suicide boats and human torpedoes. The intention was not to defeat the invasion. It was to inflict casualties on such a scale in the first weeks that American public opinion would force Washington to negotiate rather than accept the cost of a second landing near Tokyo. That strategy required exactly one thing to be true, that Japan faced one enemy, and that enemy had to come by sea. The Soviet entry destroyed it in a single night. Not because Soviet tanks would reach Tokyo, they would not soon. It destroyed Ketsugo for 2 reasons. First, it removed the diplomatic destination. There was no longer any mediator. Fighting on to obtain better terms only makes sense if there is somebody to obtain them from. Now, the choice was not between good terms and bad terms. It was between the Potsdam Declaration and nothing. Second, it opened a second front against a country that could not hold the first. For the peace faction, the Soviet declaration was, in a bitter way, more useful than Hiroshima. Hiroshima could be argued with. Hiroshima could be reduced to a technical problem. 1.5 million Soviet soldiers moving across Manchuria could not be argued with by anyone. The Supreme Council convened at about 10:30 on the morning of the 9th of August. 6 men, Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro, 77, who had been shot 4 times in 1936 by young officers who thought he was too moderate. Foreign Minister Togo, 62. Navy Minister Yonai Mitsumasa, 65. War Minister Anami, 58. Army Chief of Staff Umezu Yoshijiro, 63. Navy Chief of Staff Toyota Soemu, 60. The question before them was whether to accept the Potsdam Declaration. Togo argued for acceptance with a single condition, a guarantee of the position of the emperor. Yonai supported him. Suzuki, Hue, leaned the same direction. Anami, Umezu, and Toyota would not accept a single condition. They demanded 4, preservation of the imperial institution, no occupation of the Japanese home islands, or at most a token one. Japan to disarm its own forces rather than be disarmed. Japan to conduct its own war crimes trials. Read those 4 conditions carefully because they tell you what the argument in Tokyo had actually been about all along. They are not the conditions of men who think they can win. There is nothing in them about territory, about victory, about the empire. Every one of them is about the survival of the Japanese state as a self-governing thing, and about the survival of the men in the room. No occupation means no foreign soldiers in Japan. Self-disarmament means the army dissolves itself with its honor intact, rather than being disarmed at gunpoint. Our own trials means the Japanese government decides what to do with its own officers. The peace faction thought those conditions were fantasy. The Allies would never accept them, and the time spent demanding them would be paid for in cities. The war faction thought unconditional surrender meant the annihilation of the kokutai, the national polity, the entire structure of Japan as a nation under a divine imperial line. Better, in that reading, to fight and lose than to hand it over. 3 against 3, again. At 2 minutes past 11 that morning, while the Supreme Council was sitting, a B-29 named Boxcar dropped a plutonium implosion bomb called Fat Man over the Urakami Valley of Nagasaki. Nagasaki had not been the target. Kokura was the target. Boxcar arrived over Kokura and found it obscured haze and smoke drifting from a conventional firebombing of nearby Yahata the day before. Major Charles Sweeney made 3 passes. The aiming point never came clear. Fuel was becoming critical because of a transfer pump failure before takeoff. They turned for the secondary target. Nagasaki was also cloud-covered. At the last moment, a break opened and the bomb was released, roughly 2 miles off the intended aiming point, into a valley whose surrounding hills confined the blast. The yield was larger than Hiroshima's, around 21 kilotons. The terrain and the mist reduced the effect. Somewhere in the region of 40,000 people were killed immediately. By the end of 1945, the toll would be around 70,000. The industrial heart of the Urakami Valley was destroyed, including the Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works. So was Urakami Cathedral, the largest Christian church in East Asia, in the district that had been home to Japan's oldest Catholic community, people whose ancestors had kept the faith underground for 250 years of persecution. A fragmentary report reached Tokyo before the Supreme Council broke up. Confirmation came through the afternoon. And now we come to the single most important fact in this entire story. The one that almost every telling gets wrong. Nagasaki changed nothing. Not 1 vote moved. Read that again. The second atomic bomb in the history of the world was dropped on a Japanese city during a meeting of the 6 men governing Japan. And when the meeting resumed, it was still 3 against 3. Anami did not change his position. Umezu did not change his. Toyota did not change his. It did not change a vote. What it changed was the clock. Why not? Because the war faction's argument had never been that the bomb was survivable in the sense of being pleasant. Their argument was that the bomb did not solve the American problem. The Americans still had to land troops to occupy Japan and compel a surrender. And the moment they landed, the calculus returned to men and ground and casualties where Japan still had something to bargain with. A second bomb confirmed there was more than one. It did not change that logic by a single degree, and there was a colder observation available to them. Nagasaki, because of the hills and the mists, had killed roughly half as many people as Hiroshima. The Army's own casualty ledger for the war ran into the millions. 2 cities in that ledger were a terrible entry. They were not the end of the book. This is the fact that has fueled 60 years of argument among historians, whether it was the bombs or the Soviets that ended the war, whether either alone would have been enough. Serious scholars disagree with each other in print, and the honest answer is that the evidence supports a combination rather than a single cause. But the raw fact is not in dispute. On the 9th of August, 1945, after Hiroshima and after Nagasaki and after 1.5 million Soviet troops crossed into Manchuria, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War of the Empire of Japan was deadlocked 3-3. The meeting adjourned without a decision. A full cabinet meeting followed in the afternoon and ran into the evening. 15 ministers now, not 6. It also failed. Under the rules, the cabinet had to be unanimous to act, and it was not. Evening came. Nothing had been decided. 2 cities were burning. An army was disintegrating in Manchuria, and a government that had been arguing for 4 days had produced no policy at all. And here, finally, the machinery that had been jammed since June began to move, not because anyone was persuaded, but because the deadlock itself became intolerable. Marquis Kido Koichi, 56, Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, had spent the day moving between the palace and the government. He had access to the emperor that no minister had. Through the afternoon and evening of the 9th, Kido and Suzuki worked out a plan that had no precedent in the modern history of Japan. They would convene an imperial conference, a formal meeting in the emperor's presence. And when it deadlocked, as it certainly would, the prime minister would do something no Japanese prime minister had ever done. He would ask the emperor to decide. This was not a constitutional procedure. There was no provision for it. The emperor did not break ties. The emperor approved decisions already reached. For the throne to choose between factions was to expose it politically, to make it responsible, to place it in the middle of a fight between armed men. Suzuki knew precisely what that risked. He carried 4 bullet scars from the last time young officers decided the throne was being manipulated by moderates. He was 77 years old, and he arranged it anyway. Just before midnight on the 9th of August, in the humid dark of a Tokyo summer, a small group of men walked into the imperial palace grounds and went underground. The room was too small for what was about to happen in it. 30 feet by 18, concrete walls sweating in the August heat. A low ceiling, wooden chairs and a long table covered in cloth, and at the head of it a small separate table with a single chair, where a 44-year-old man in a plain military uniform sat down and did not speak. Emperor Hirohito had been brought to a basement to listen to his government fail. It was 2 minutes before midnight on the 9th of August, 1945. Above them, Tokyo lay in the dark, most of it burned already, the survivors sleeping in shelters and in the shells of houses. Not one of them knew this meeting was taking place. The Big Six were there. So was the chief cabinet secretary, Sakamizu Hisa, 42, who had drafted the documents. So was Baron Hiranuma Kichiro, president of the Privy Council. Kido was present. The men were in formal dress cutaway coats or full uniform because protocol did not bend for the end of the world. Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro rose and opened the conference. 77 years old, hard of hearing, moving with the deliberateness of a man who has been shot 4 times and lived. He asked Sakamizu Hisatsune to read the Potsdam Declaration aloud. They sat in a bunker at midnight and listened to the terms of their own defeat read out in full. Then the argument began, and it was the same argument. That is the thing that has to be understood about this night. Nobody in that room said anything new. Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori made the case for acceptance with one condition: the preservation of the imperial house. Navy Minister Yone Mitsumasa supported him. War Minister Anami Korachika made the case for 4 conditions: no occupation, self-disarmament, Japanese trials for Japanese officers, and the imperial institution preserved. He did not rage, he argued. He said the army had not been defeated in the home islands, that the decisive battle had not yet been fought, that a nation that surrendered without fighting that battle would have surrendered something it could never recover. He asked for the chance to fight once on Japanese soil and to negotiate from whatever was left afterward. General Umezu Yoshijiro supported him. Admiral Toyota Somu supported him. Baron Hiranuma Kichiro, president of the Privy Council, 78 years old, questioned each man in turn. A long, dry interrogation about food supplies, about air defense, about whether the army could actually do what it was promising. The answers were not good. Umezu admitted the beach defenses might not hold. Anami admitted there was no certainty of victory. Hiranuma asked the question directly: if there is no certainty, what exactly are we asking the nation to endure this for? Nobody had a good answer, and still nobody changed their vote. 2 o'clock in the morning came, the 10th of August now. 2 hours in that room, and the count was exactly what it had been at 10:30 the previous morning, before Nagasaki. 3 against 3. And then Suzuki Kantaro did the thing he had planned with Kido that afternoon, the thing that had no constitutional basis whatsoever. He crossed the floor, and he stood before the emperor, and he said that the conference could not reach a decision, and that the situation was too grave to leave undecided. He asked His Majesty for his opinion. Every man in that room understood what had just happened. Suzuki had reached past 1,000 years of arrangement and pulled the throne into a political fight. If it went wrong, if the army decided the emperor had been manipulated by weak advisors, men in that room would be dead within a week. Hirohito stood up. He was slight, nearsighted, softly spoken. He had spent his adult life being addressed and not answering. His voice, when the country finally heard it a few days later, would strike most Japanese as strange, high, formal, using court language that ordinary people could barely follow. He said he had thought about this at length, and that he had come to the same conclusion as the foreign minister. Then he explained why, and the reasons he gave were not about physics or diplomacy. He said he had been told repeatedly that the defenses of the homeland were prepared, and that when he had inquired he had found they were not. He said the divisions raised for the decisive battle did not have their equipment. He said he could not see how Japan could resist an invasion under those conditions. And he said that he could not bear to see his people suffer any longer, that to continue the war meant the destruction of the nation and the extinction of civilization itself. Then he said something that fell on that room like a physical weight. He said he knew what he was asking of the officers and men of the armed forces, that he understood how bitter it would be for them to disarm and for loyal servants to be punished as war criminals. He said he understood their feelings, and then he asked them to bear it. Sakamizu Hisatsune, taking notes at 42 years old later, wrote that men in that room were weeping openly, sobbing, some of them with their faces down, generals in full uniform, admirals, ministers of state, in a concrete box under a palace at 2 o'clock in the morning. The emperor left the room, and Suzuki, moving fast now, did the second half of the maneuver. He turned to the cabinet and asked whether they would adopt His Majesty's expressed will as the decision of the government. Nobody could say no. To refuse would have been to declare open opposition to the throne in the throne's own house. Anami Korechika did not refuse. Hold on to that. The single most powerful obstacle to the surrender of Japan, the man who could have brought down the government by walking out of the room, stayed and assented. At around 7 o'clock on the morning of the 10th of August, Japan transmitted its acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration to the Allies through the neutral governments of Switzerland and Sweden. It contained one condition: that the declaration did not comprise any demand which would prejudice the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. That single sentence was about to nearly undo everything. Now, cross to Washington. The Japanese note arrived and produced immediate division inside the American government. Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Navy Secretary James Forrestal argued for accepting it. The emperor would be needed to make the surrender stick, and demanding his removal might mean fighting every Japanese garrison from Manchuria to Java one at a time. Others argued the opposite, and they had the American public behind them. This was a nation that had spent 4 years being told about Pearl Harbor, about Bataan, about the treatment of prisoners. Unconditional surrender had been the stated Allied policy since Casablanca in 1943. To accept a condition now, and a condition protecting the man in whose name the whole war had been fought, was politically close to impossible. Secretary of State James Burns drafted the reply, and it was a masterpiece of deliberate ambiguity. It said that from the moment of surrender, the authority of the emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state would be subject to the supreme commander for the Allied powers. Subject to, not abolished, not preserved, subject to. And it said the ultimate form of government of Japan would be established by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. That was Burns threading a needle. To American ears, it meant no guarantee for the emperor. To Japanese ears, well, that depended entirely on which Japanese ears. The Burns note reached Tokyo in the early hours of the 12th of August, and the deal came apart. The Foreign Ministry translated the crucial phrase in a way that softened it closer to restricted by than subject to. The Army General Staff translated it the hard way and read it as exactly what it was: the Emperor of Japan reduced to a subordinate of a foreign general. The second sentence was worse: the ultimate form of government to be decided by the freely expressed will of the people. To the war faction, that was not democracy. That was a proposal to hold a vote on whether the imperial line should continue at all, a line they believed unbroken for 2,500 years. Anami, Umezu, and Toyota now argued that the Burns note failed to meet the one condition the emperor himself had approved, and that Japan must reject it and fight. And here is the terrible thing. On the text, they had a case. Japan had accepted on the understanding that the imperial prerogatives were safe. The reply did not say they were safe. It said something carefully designed not to say anything. A government that had surrendered on a condition was now being told the condition might not exist. The Supreme Council reconvened, deadlocked again. The cabinet met, deadlocked again. 2 days passed, the 12th, the 13th. 2 days in which Japan had accepted surrender, been answered, and stalled while American aircraft continued flying and the Soviets continued advancing through Manchuria and Korea. And in the Army Ministry, in the offices below the men at the top, younger officers had begun to talk. They were majors and lieutenant colonels, staff officers, most of them in their 30s. They had spent the war moving pins on maps while men their age died in the Pacific, and they had reached a conclusion that felt to them like the only honorable one available. The emperor had been misled. Weak advisors around the throne, Kido, Suzuki, Togo, Yonai, had presented him with a false picture and extracted a decision he would never have made if he knew the truth. Therefore, the correct action was not rebellion against the emperor. It was to liberate the emperor from the men surrounding him. That reasoning has a specific name in Japanese history. It is exactly the logic of the young officers who tried to seize Tokyo in February 1936, the ones who shot Suzuki Kantaro in his home. At the center of the group was Major Hatanaka Kenji, 33 years old, a staff officer in the Military Affairs Bureau of the Army Ministry. Intense, sleepless, described by those who knew him as almost feverish in those days. With him was Lieutenant Colonel Shizaki Jiro and several others. Their plan required one thing above all others. It required the Minister of War. If Anami Korechika joined them, the army would follow. If Anami stayed out, they had nothing but a handful of officers and whatever troops they could deceive. They went to him. More than once. Through the 13th and into the 14th of August, they pressed him. Anami did not say yes. He also did not say no in a way that ended it. And he did not have them arrested. He listened. He deflected. He told them to wait. Historians have argued for 80 years about what he was doing. The most persuasive reading is this: Anami was holding the army together. If he denounced them outright, the fanatics would move immediately and without him. If he encouraged them, the country would fall into civil war with two atomic-armed enemies at the gates. So he kept them close, and he kept them waiting, and he burned the clock. He was buying hours with his own ambiguity. On the morning of the 14th of August, the emperor summoned a second imperial conference. He did not wait to be asked this time. Kido had gone to him that morning. American aircraft had begun dropping leaflets over Tokyo containing the text of the Japanese offer and the Allied reply. Once ordinary Japanese and ordinary soldiers read those leaflets, the government's paralysis would become public, and the army's reaction would be uncontrollable. The conference convened before noon in the same underground room. This time, all the senior ministers and the military chiefs were present, more than 20 men. Anami spoke again. Toyota spoke. The same case. The Burns note was unacceptable. The imperial house was not guaranteed. One more battle. Hirohito listened, and then he ended it. He said he had studied the Allied reply and considered it acceptable. He said that continuing the war would mean the destruction of the nation and further suffering he could not bear. He said that he did not care what happened to him personally. And then he said the thing that broke the room. He said he wished to make a broadcast to speak directly to the people himself in his own voice so that they would understand. No Japanese emperor had ever addressed his people by radio. The public had never heard Hirohito speak. To most of the nation, he was not a man with a voice. He was an institution, a presence, something closer to a fact of nature. He was proposing to become audible. He asked the cabinet to prepare an imperial rescript. He asked the ministers to help him. And he told the military men that if there were officers who could not accept it, he would go and speak to them personally. Anami Korechika wept. The cabinet met that afternoon and worked through the rescript line by line. Sakamizu Hisatsune drafted it in classical court Japanese, and the ministers argued over phrases into the evening. The language had to say that Japan was surrendering without ever using a word that meant surrender. It contained the line that has outlived everyone in the room, that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. And it contained the phrase the emperor had used in the bunker 4 nights earlier, that the time had come to endure the unendurable, to bear the unbearable. Every minister signed it, including the Minister of War. That night, technicians from the Japan Broadcasting Corporation brought recording equipment into the Imperial Household Ministry building on the palace grounds. Sometime around 11 o'clock in the evening, the emperor recorded the rescript. He did it twice. He thought the first recording was poor. His voice had been too quiet, and he had stumbled. The second was judged usable, though not by much. 2 10-inch phonograph records. That is what the surrender of the Japanese Empire physically consisted of at midnight on the 14th of August. 2 discs, still warm, in a room in a palace in a city where a group of officers with pistols were already moving. The records were placed in a small metal safe in a room used by an empress's attendants in the palace complex and covered with papers. That decision saved an unknown number of lives. The Kyujo incident began late on the night of the 14th of August and lasted until dawn. Hatanaka Kenji and his fellow conspirators had one obstacle standing between them and the palace, the 1st Imperial Guards Division. It was the unit responsible for the physical protection of the emperor and the palace grounds, and its commander was Lieutenant General Mori Takeshi, 51 years old. Mori's cooperation was essential. Without orders from the division commander, the guards would not move. Hatanaka went to Mori's office in the small hours of the 15th and asked him to join the rising. Mori refused. He did not refuse quickly. He talked. The accounts suggest a long conversation, perhaps an hour, Mori stalling, arguing, refusing to be hurried into anything. His brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Shiraishi Michinori, was in the room with him. At some point, Hatanaka ran out of patience or nerve, and he shot Mori Takeshi dead. Another officer killed Shiraishi with a sword. A Japanese general, in his own office, in the palace grounds, by a Japanese mate on the last night of the war. They then took Mori's official seal and used it to forge a set of orders, Strategic Order number 584, the Imperial Guards to occupy the palace grounds, seal the gates, and cut communications. And the guards obeyed. They had no reason not to. The orders bore their dead commander's seal. For several hours before dawn on the 15th of August 1945, the Imperial Palace of Japan was under the control of mutineers. The emperor was cut off inside it, and the soldiers enforcing the isolation believed they were following lawful orders. The rebels cut the telephone lines. They detained the palace staff they could find, including the president of the Japan Broadcasting Corporation. They searched. They were looking for 2 phonograph records. Picture it. Officers with drawn pistols, moving through the corridors and outbuildings of the palace in the dark opening cabinets, pulling out drawers, questioning terrified chamberlains, in a compound they did not know well, with the electricity partly out and an air raid alert running. They searched for hours. They did not find them. The records were in a small safe in an attendant's room, under a pile of papers. Chamberlain Tokugawa Yoshihiro was questioned at sword point repeatedly through the night. He told them nothing. Elsewhere in Tokyo that night, other conspirators went to the residences of the men they blamed. A group went to Prime Minister Suzuki's official residence to kill him. He had been warned minutes before and got out. They burned the building. Then they went to his private home. He had already left there too. 77 years old, and for the second time in his life, Suzuki Kantaro walked out of a house that young officers came to burn. Others went for Kido Koichi. He hid inside the palace complex while the men hunting him searched nearby. And the coup failed for one reason above all others. It failed because it was too small. Hatanaka went to the Eastern District Army, the command responsible for the Tokyo region, and asked them to join. They refused and began organizing to move against him. He went to the commander of another guards unit, refused again. He sought support from senior officers all night and got none. General Tanaka Shizuichi, commanding the Eastern District Army, came to the palace personally in the early morning. He walked in and confronted the guards officers, told them the orders they were following were forged, and ordered them back to their barracks. They obeyed, because he was a general, and because the orders had been a lie, and because the Japanese army, in the end, held. Hatanaka made one last attempt. He got to the Japan Broadcasting Corporation studios and demanded airtime to explain himself to the nation. The staff refused. There was an air raid alert and a technical excuse and simple courage. He was not given a microphone. Around dawn on the 15th of August, Major Hatanaka Kenji rode a horse onto the plaza in front of the Imperial Palace, scattering leaflets explaining why he had done what he did. Then he put a pistol to his forehead and killed himself. Lieutenant Colonel Shiozaki Jiro, beside him, cut himself with a sword and then shot himself. And in a house in the Miyakazaka district of Tokyo, a few hours earlier, the Minister of War had already made his own arrangements. Anami Korechika spent the last part of the night of the 14th of August drinking sake with his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Takeshita Masahiko, who was himself one of the conspirators, and who had spent days trying to recruit him. Anami had signed the rescript. He had spent the evening making certain the army would obey it. He had received the plotters and given them nothing. Around 5 o'clock in the morning of the 15th, on the veranda of his residence, wearing a shirt the emperor had given him, he performed seppuku. He cut himself across the abdomen. When Takeshita offered to finish it the traditional role of the second, who ends the suffering, Anami refused. He took hours to die. He left 2 short written statements. One offered his death and apology to the emperor for his great crime, a phrase historians still argue over. Apology for the defeat, for the conduct of the war, for failing to prevent the surrender, or for having permitted it. The other said he believed in the imperishability of the sacred land. He was 58 years old. He was the most dangerous obstacle to the surrender of Japan, and he had the power to stop it at any point in those 10 days, and he did not use it. He argued for continuing the war, lost the argument, obeyed, held the army in place while it swallowed the worst order it would ever receive, and then killed himself. That is not a simple man to sum up. It should not be. At noon on the 15th of August, 1945 radio stations across Japan broadcast an announcement that a message from the Emperor would follow, and that all listeners should stand. Then a recording made in a palace room the night before, and hunted through the dark by men with pistols, was played to the nation. The voice was thin and high and strange. The language was archaic court Japanese, so formal that many listeners could not follow it. Farmers stood in fields around a single radio. Factory workers stood in shops. Families knelt in front of receivers in houses and in the ruins of houses. In the middle of it came a phrase in language so old that many listeners had to have it explained to them afterward, that the time had come to endure the unendurable, to bear what could not be borne. Some of them did not understand what they had been told until the announcer said it plainly, in ordinary Japanese, when the recording ended. Then they understood. People wept in the streets. People knelt on the gravel outside the palace and bowed to the ground, some of them apologizing to the emperor for having failed him. Some soldiers refused to believe it. Several hundred officers and men across Japan took their own lives in the following days. Vice Admiral Onishi Taki, 54, who had created the kamikaze program and sent thousands of young men to fly into ships, killed himself on the 16th of August. He left a note apologizing to the spirits of those pilots and to their families. And he refused a second and refused medical help, and he died slowly over a full day. And in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki, people who had survived the 6th and the 9th of August heard the broadcast in tents and in schoolyards turned into aid stations and went on dying. That is the part that does not fit into the story of the 9 days, because the deaths did not stop when the war stopped. By the end of December 1945, the toll at Hiroshima had risen to somewhere around 140,000. At Nagasaki, to around 70,000. Those figures are estimates, and they carry uncertainty, because the records burned along with the people who kept them. Some died of burns in the following weeks. Some died of injuries in a city with almost no doctors and no medicine. And thousands died of the thing Nishina Yoshio had identified when he walked through the ruins: radiation, working through the marrow, taking people who had walked away without a visible scratch. The dying continued for decades. Cancers appeared years later. Children who had been in the womb in August 1945 were born with damage. The survivors acquired a name in Japanese hibakusha, explosion-affected people, and many of them spent their lives concealing it because there was prejudice against them, fear that the sickness was contagious, that it was hereditary, that marrying one was a risk. They survived the bomb and then were quietly punished for it. Nishina Yoshio, the physicist who had gone to Hiroshima on the 8th of August and worked out from roof tiles and shadows what had happened, died in 1951 at 60. Leukemia. Whether it came from his days in the ruins or from a career around cyclotrons and radioactive materials, nobody can say with certainty. Field Marshal Hata Shunroku, who survived 1.5 miles from the hypocenter, was tried at Tokyo for war crimes committed in China and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was paroled and lived until 1962. Suzuki Kantaro, who was shot 4 times in 1936 and hunted through Tokyo in 1945, died in his bed in 1948, aged 80. Togo Shigenori, who had argued for peace from the beginning and pursued the Soviet mediation that never existed, was convicted at the Tokyo trials and sentenced to 20 years. He died in prison custody in 1950. Kido Koichi, who engineered the 2 imperial conferences, was sentenced to life and paroled in 1955. Sato Naotake, the ambassador in Moscow who told his government the truth and was ignored, was never charged with anything. He served in the post-war Japanese parliament and became president of the upper house. He lived to 1971, aged 88. Okayoshi, the 14-year-old schoolgirl in the bunker under Hiroshima Castle, who sent the first report of the atomic bombing of a city, survived. She lived a long life and spoke publicly about that morning as an old woman. The first person on Earth to report what an atomic bomb had done to a city was a child on a switchboard, and she outlived nearly every general in this story. So what did the Japanese High Command say when they realized Hiroshima had vanished? The honest answer is the one this story has been circling from the first minute. They said the lines must be down. They said it cannot be atomic, because we tried and it cannot be done. They said the field marshal survived, so the weapon is not decisive. They said the Americans are bluffing. They said after Nagasaki, exactly. what they had said before Nagasaki, because two destroyed cities did not move a single vote in the room where it mattered. And then, in a concrete basement at 2 o'clock in the morning, a man who was not supposed to speak at all said that he could not bear it any longer, and that the time had come to endure the unendurable, and the men who had spent 10 days refusing to yield to a weapon that killed 100,000 people yielded instead to a quiet sentence from a nearsighted marine biologist in a plain uniform. That is the thing worth sitting with. The bomb did not end the war by itself, neither did the Soviets. What ended it was that the bombs and the Soviet armies together destroyed every remaining argument for going on, and that's a system with no mechanism for breaking a tie was forced by 77-year-old Suzuki Kantaro with 4 bullet scars in his body to invent one. Hiroshima did not vanish. That is the last correction this story owes you. It was a city with 270,000 survivors in it, and they had to walk through what was left and find their families and bury them and keep living in the place where it happened. The city was rebuilt. People went back. There is a park now where the firestorm was, and a single skeletal dome left standing on purpose, because it was near enough to the hypocenter that the blast came almost straight down, and the walls did not fall. It is the only building in the world kept in ruins to preserve the memory of a single second. And every August, at 16 minutes past 8 in the morning, a bell rings there, and the city stopped.